Welcome to Vices and Volumes, the podcast that brings forgotten stories from the 1800s back to life. I'm Avril, and each episode I dive into old books, manuscripts, and journals to uncover the fascinating tales, beliefs, and characteristics that shaped our past. From gothic ghost stories to social customs, from scientific curiosities to supernatural folklore. If it's tucked away in these pages of history, I'm going to find it and I'm going to share it with you. Today, I bring you How and Where to Fish in Ireland by Hi Regan. First published in 1886, this isn't just a fishing guide. It's a window into Victorian Ireland through the eyes of Captain John Joseph Dunn, a charming rogue who lived on wit while perpetually dodging debt collectors. From particular coil horn devices to paraffin-based midge repellent to railway networks and landlord permissions, we'll discover how this delightful scoundrel turned his fishing obsession into a literary success. So I have a bit of a confession to make about today's book. I found it online, but that's not the confession. It's called How and Where to Fish in Ireland by Hi Regan. And I have to be honest, I did buy it for completely juvenile reasons. There was an illustration in the book that caught my eye, and the inner 12-year-old took over. I hit the buy now button faster than a teenager deleting their browsing history when they hear you walking down the hallway. I didn't even check the price or the condition. I'll explain the image to you now. The image is of a horn-shaped device with a leather base plate and two leather straps. I'll tell you a bit more about that later, but when it arrived, this book was in a white envelope. You know the bubble wrap ones, the plastic on the inside? Well, it had festered in that envelope. It was basically a science experiment gone wrong. I opened up the envelope and I was hit in the face by the smell of mould. The pages of the book were covered in mould. It was all black around the edges. It had even gone right into the spine where there was black marks on the inside. The front cover was all crinkly and damp and wet. So the book was actually sent to me damp because the outside of the envelope was actually fine. So I left it on the heating pipes for several days, and I was finally able to look at the book and clean it up a little bit. But despite its outward appearance, it turned out to be quite charming. The book that I have is the 10th edition. This one was printed in 1900, but the actual book itself is from 1886. What I loved about this straight away when I opened it up was the book had the map fully intact. But the curious bit about the map was something I'd forgotten in Irish history. And in fact, I mentioned to a couple of friends, and they didn't even know in some cases, that Laois and Offaly on the map were missing. Renamed the Kings and Queens County in 1556 during the reign of Queen Mary I, and they were returned to their original Irish names, Laois and Offaly, in 1922 when Ireland gained independence. So on this map, because it is pre-1922, the map is down as the King and Queen's County. But the other thing that I noticed straight away was the map is mostly railroads. There's no roads on the map. If you think about this again, the 18th century, the first car arrived in Ireland in 1896 and it was steam powered, imported from France. So there weren't any roads for car travel. There were roads, but they would have been for cart, they would have been for bicycle and foot, etc. So they weren't developed yet. So Hi Regan got around via railroad most of the time. The writer also has a charming mention of rail travel in Ireland. On page 2, he mentions the Shannon rods are universally spliced rods in two pieces. And only real drawback I know of in their construction is the length of the case they demand. However, it's not a consequence in Ireland, as the railways are all broad gauge and the nets of the carriages permit the rod to be easily carried in them. So I feel like this is a little bit more of a boast than it actually is about the rods or the railways, because we've won up on the English there, that we have our broad gauge railways and we can carry whichever rod we want. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author. There's not a whole lot of info available about him, but as I dug, I got more and more interested in this character. His name, Hi Regan, is actually a pseudonym. His real name is Captain John Joseph Dunn. This name, Hi Regan, gives us a little indication about how he felt about Ireland and possibly a little bit of an overblown ego as well. Hi Regan references an ancient Irish chieftain, the title, the Chief of the O'Duns of Britis. Captain John Joseph Dunn was actually born in 1837 in Ballybritis, County Laois, Ireland. He was educated in Clongowes College in Kildare, and he had a varied career as a soldier, politician, a civil servant, a journalist, and an artist, even showing his works later in London. Before his death, he actually showed them in his own gallery.
He starts off as a British Army officer and travels the world with varied careers and then returns back to Ireland, where he becomes a prison governor. Around about the same time, he threw himself into Irish politics and he became the secretary of the Irish Home Rule movement. And that was around about 1870 to 1875. He worked alongside Isaac Butt, who was pushing for Irish self-governance. He was a man who cared deeply for his country, and he indicates this in the introduction. He first professes he's no expert, and that's to ward off the Victorian trolls. They were there at that time, they just took a little longer to come. They were by letter. There was less of them because there weren't as many people who could write a letter. However, he says, I shall not claim perfection for my directions. And then he closes with his passionate and very heartfelt statement. I had two ends in my writing. One will have been served if, by following my advice, my readers get sport. Their success in fishing will be the measure of mine in writing. The other end is that many kindly Englishmen may, in the pursuit of an enchanting sport, add to their scant knowledge of my beautiful and unhappy country and its pure-hearted, sport-loving people. The Fishing Guide wasn't Dunn's only book. He also wrote an autobiography in 1896 called Here and There Memories. Again, this was under the Hi Regan pseudonym. It was full of stories about all the famous people he'd encountered, including Oscar Wilde and Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde. As I dug a little deeper into his story, I found that there was a little tarnish to this man's seemingly shining history and possibly explaining the abundance of time that this man had to go fishing. The first sign of the tarnish was, and as I understand it, it was a review of his autobiography by one of his own relatives, or maybe a commentary on it. Terence DeVere White, seemingly a little frustrated with him, wrote that Dunn was a born liar if his reminiscences are to be judged. Let's face it, everybody loves a little bit of gossip, and this is where it piqued my interest, and I began to dig a little further. It does seem that Dunn may have been a little bit of a blackguard. By 1859, he had been cashiered from the military. That's dishonourably dismissed. Having to then serve as a volunteer in the Maori War in New Zealand, he returned to Ireland in 1870, having been an undercover munitions agent in Chile for the British, who were not officially involved. Since the Spanish Navy had put a price on his head, it does seem like a really good time to come home to Ireland. But back in Ireland, he fell on hard times, and it seems that he ended up in Dublin's Marshalsea prison for debtors. That's the same notorious debtors' prison that Dickens wrote about. You can only imagine the conditions of this prison. It would have been abhorrent. Somehow around this time, he managed to wrangle a job in the Irish prison service. But he then got himself dismissed for that one for misconduct. His occupation of Secretary of the Home Rule movement now seems to fit perfectly into place then. And if you notice the timeline, while he was in debtors' prison, while he returned to Ireland, he was part of the Home Rule movement. So there's a whole lot of curious timeline there. So it appears, despite the title of captain, Dunn was consistently unemployed and perpetually in debt throughout his life. As his frustrated relative DeVere White put it, he existed primarily on air and other people. Much to my surprise, I really enjoyed reading this book on fishing, which I didn't think would be of interest to me at all. I had 3 evenings of lures, flies, bait, and tackle. It was most obvious that Dunn was completely obsessed with fishing, and you can feel the passion and the love for it in almost every word. The more I learned about Dunn and his roguish qualities, along with the words, I found myself increasingly fond of him. I highly recommend getting yourself a copy of this, because as you read through the book, you see that there is an element of storytelling. The more I learned about Dunn and his roguish qualities, along with his words, I found myself increasingly fond of him. And having found out that he was a little bit of a blackguard made it even better, because I could see the little cheeky side of him. I could see that some of his stories were a little bit exaggerated, and maybe he was looking more for notoriety than anything else and a little bit of recognition. While the book is obsessive about fishing, it's not all hooks and reels. There are moments of humour and very sound advice. Particularly this one I liked was on baskets. Whether the angler uses baskets or bags, there is much to be said on their respective merits. The great thing is to have them big enough. I have not myself seen any improvement on the basket of my boyhood, but metal hinges and the arrangement for carrying a flask and sandwich. Though in practice I prefer carrying a metal bait, gut or fly box in the compartment for sandwiches, as I have a prejudice against raw fish as a flavour for luncheon. He rarely refers to eating fish in the adventures, but there is a passage in chapter 3, The Trout and Some of His Relations, where he reminisces of a catch and then tells us how challenging fish should be cooked. And I can tell you that I felt this was delicious. In fact, I am going to catch myself a trout and cook it in this way to see for myself how it tastes. Although, do I take the recommendations of a Victorian man on cooking? I'm not sure. So the trout that he speaks of here is a specific type of trout called a gillaroo. I thought trout was trout and there was no such thing other than trout, but apparently a gillaroo is a different type of trout. Once during luncheon with the boats down, a friend who could not sleep comfortably unless with the consciousness that some dodge against a fish was at work killed the most symmetrical gillaroo I have seen. His bait was a good gudgeon on live bait tackle, such as I describe elsewhere. The fish took over 10 minutes of play before showing his golden belly. Gillaroo have more gold than any fish. He turned 3 pounds exactly, and he was the handsomest small-headed gillaroo I ever saw. We examined his gizzard to be sure of his family tree, ate him, cooked in grease paper over turf embers, and chanted the funeral hymn, the Cusheen Lown, to a tumbler accompaniment. I have said that as a rule a gillaroo trout is not good eating. Usually if brought home he can only be made so by being boiled in the softest water till nearly cooked. When cool, cut him across into collops. Dip him in batter of egg and cream, and then in breadcrumbs and finely chopped shallot, and brown him gently in a pan with plenty of butter, oil or lard at boiling point. When cooked, the collops should be placed before a clear fire to run off the oil before being served. Tarragon vinegar and cold butter. Finally, depart from him handsomely if eaten from the hook as directed later. For a lake trout, even a gillaroo is on occasion food fit for demigods. He mentions here the Crusheen Lown, and I love the fact that this is mentioned because it's a real connection to being Irish. The Crusheen Lown is a drinking song, and it is called the Full Jug, and that's why it was played to a tumbler accompaniment. I love that. So, the book is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is how to fish, and part 2 is where to fish section. He tells us of the how to fish. We get some insight into the equipment, the tools, the clothes at the time, mentioning the use of paraffin, beeswax, tallow, and other things that we have now replaced with synthetics, plastic, and Gore-Tex. And he touches this on chapter 7, page 94. To keep off midges, the best and nearest mixture is made of melted marrow or fat well mixed with crude paraffin. The next best is turpentine and glycerine. The most agreeable but inefficient is fragrant tobacco smoke. It's a wonder he didn't actually set himself on fire with some of these combinations. Then he goes on to his boots. No dubbing keeps water out. The best to keep boots partially waterproof and quite pliant is tallow, Vaseline, and paraffin, rubbed in when the boots are quite dry. To keep the boots right, they should be wiped clean and treed, if only for 10 minutes. When taken off, then filled with oats or stuffed with bran and dried in a current but not near the fire. If a fisherman has no change of stocking boots or socks to wear when driving home some distance and is unwilling to go barefoot during the jaunt, he had better defer to the national libation till he gets into dry things and bestow the whisky on his feet. Speaking of whisky, he moves on to drink the wine of the country and of John Jameson's Make It If Possible. In any quantity, but never early. The native habit can't be broken through with impunity. So you can see he is a humorous man. There's plenty of little stories in here. There's lots of little comments, and he does give sound advice. And this book is still being used today. And also, there has been reprints. One I found as recently as 2015. So it is a good and valuable book, particularly when it comes to fishing. He does mention in the book elsewhere that fishing in Ireland is slightly different to fishing in England. And I love this because he mentions that you cannot necessarily catch trout in England with the same things that you can catch trout in Ireland with. There's so much to part two, as Dunn lists fishing locations throughout the country. While part one is probably the meatier part of the book, the more educational side about fishing, I found that part two was very much the heart of it. He brings us through Ireland, pointing out places and names I myself know well, but as he describes them, there's so much more wild and untouched, with landmarks that are still there and drastically changed. I have to say that in my mind, it was like seeing the landscape at a lake. This is how I pictured it as he told me about Ireland in the era that I've never seen. In my mind, the way I pictured it was that similar to looking at a scenery scape of a lake. You can see the clear scene before you, and you can see the hills and all around you. But as you look at the water on the lake, the breeze disturbs the water, and you can see the same. It's just a little altered and blurred. And that's how I saw everything he described. On page 127, he's in County Cork. Between Cork and Macroom, there is capital trout river, the South Bride, the best in the west or South Cork. Near where it joins the Lee is the Dripsey, which runs in from the north, as do the Blarney River and its fellow the Mark. Coachford is not a bad place for an early start to the Lee or the Dripsey, but the accommodation might be improved. Blarney is a delightful place, and the sanatorium there is a pleasant standpoint for the observation of the oddities of humanity. Good stories abound there. The proprietor is one of the finest anglers in Ireland. I immediately knew where he was talking about. This is Eglinton Lunatic Asylum. It opened in 1852, housing 500 psychiatric patients at a time. It's a stunning building, beautiful architecture, big grey front on it. It's impossible to miss. It was renamed to Our Lady's Hospital in 1952, still an asylum at the time, and in 1992 it closed its doors. Today, it has been repurposed as apartments and it's now named Atkins Hall. What an amazing place to have an apartment. There was one particular place that brought me absolute joy, and it's very personal to me as well. It's called Meelick, and it was a great joy to see this. It gets a decent paragraph and so deserving. This is on page 142. He says, the best fishing on the eastern side of Galway is confined mainly to the Shannon along Derg, from Portumna to Banagher. In both these little towns are hotels and good boats and skilful boatmen, and at Meelick there really are some admirable casts, which in early spring and in autumn yield sport. Farmhouse lodgings are to be got there, and there is a little cosy inn. Summer fish come up in June, just after the disappearance of the mayfly and the derg, and therefore Meelick deserves attention. In any interval which may occur between the mayfly and the summer run, gillaroo may be killed in Derg, and capital brown trout in the run, and about the islands at Meelick. So Meelick to me is quite special. If you go into Meelick itself, there's a lovely house on the left-hand side, an old farmhouse, and probably what he's referring to here. And on the right-hand side, then, there is a small pub and shop that is probably the inn he's talking about because it's been there forever. And just around the corner, there's the most beautiful little church that is one of the oldest churches in Ireland. I'll leave you to research that yourself. And it is just stunning. It's so peaceful in there. It's a pretty church. The whole inside is just breathtaking, but so simple at the same time. You have these beautiful views out onto the Shannon as well from Meelick, and they're quite special views. But returning back to the river, there's Meelick Quay. And Meelick Quay for me has always been fascinating. It seems like nothing. It is a quay wall. There is a bit of grass there. We've pulled up in a boat there a few times. And every time I've been there, and I cannot wait to get there every time because there's always something entertaining and unusual happens there. I'll give you a list of a few of the things that I can remember. One day, a load of horse boxes pulled down, and out came these two men commanding two horses, and they were an absolute bag of chaos is all I can describe them. They walked the horses into the water and they had to be under the commanding eye of a matriarch, and she justifiably managed this comical pair, Darcy and Finn. I'll never forget the two of them. They would have been fitting characters for a comedy act. The next thing we had down there was an enormous Kenworth 4x4 camper van called the Patagonia. It was owned by this French couple. They traveled through the summer throughout the world on this amazing camper van. And then they spent the winter back in France. They wined and dined us. We talked about both our lives. Very interesting evening with them. And I had the most beautiful headache the next morning. Another time it was a peaceful morning, absolutely gorgeous. There wasn't a ripple on the river, dead quiet, and about 15 cars pulled up. Out came loads of divers, lots of equipment, one guy who was in charge of the whole thing, and they all got into the water and swam around the boats. And as a training exercise, they decided to inspect the boats. Upon inspecting the boats, they discovered we had a massive rope tied around our prop, which explains a lot because we couldn't move very far, which they took off for us as part of their training exercise. Free service. We were delighted. At the same location, we pulled up, and there was the biggest barge I have ever seen on the Shannon. It's the largest one I've ever come across. We made friends with the barge owner and friends with him today. It's so big that it also, along with other rooms that you would have in a normal home, it has its own library and a cast iron bath. And finally, the last time we were there, we were fed by Polish chefs. They pulled up to have a barbecue themselves. They joined us, cooked us dinner, and it was the best meal I have ever had that came out of a barbecue in my entire life. And we were very lucky because we also got to taste the fish that Hi Regan mentions himself from Mealich. The captain's book's success is not simply down to the high-yield fishing grounds, but also is a travel guide of Ireland, a unique piece that tells us where to go, where to stay, who to talk to, where to get your fishing lures. In its time, it would have been quite rare and unusual. He speaks of how to choose accommodation, and he tactfully comments on hotels and inns as being adequate, clean, or could be improved. His modern-day Yelp review on page 108, he mentions the Longford Hotel. Of the Longford rivers, which all hold trout, the Inny is the best after it leaves Westmeath and becomes a river of weight. It holds many fairly large salmon, and the nearest station for fishing, it is Ballymahon, where I found a hotel which I used on the recommendation of a native who told me of it with a twinkle in his eye. 'Tis a very passable hotel if you don't like it, and it will be a very passable hotel if you do like it and the bacon and eggs. It really was tolerably good, and by the aid of Jemmy Hyland, the only reliable butcher there, one easily appreciated the truth of the Western landlady who declared bacon and fowls is elegant trimmings, but there is grand shelter in beef. I think we can come to the conclusion that she's talking about you can get food poisoning from bacon and fowl, but you don't tend to get it from beef. Poor Hi Regan. Throughout the book, he also mentions gaining permission from landowners, mentioning names such as Lord Lucan, Lord Drogheda, the Duke of Devonshire, or more so their agents, reflecting on the control of landowners at the time. Judging by Hi Regan as well, these may be name-dropping moments for him too. The one I want to point out is on page 103. The trout in this little river conditioned themselves in April. Perhaps the best fishing is about and below Moon Abbey and Mills. And also there's no difficulty as to leave fish except for a few days before the hay ripens at the verge of the meadowlands, and the sport is generally not at its best. Some of the river runs through enclosed grounds, but the exercise of good breeding in sending up a card always meets responsive courtesy. A shilling gets a reliable gossan to carry the messages, and the creel and landing net. Gossan is a term for a child in Ireland. It's like a term of endearment. A young lad or a boy would have been the case. But what I actually found about this particular piece, while he mentions this a number of times about gaining permission, paying for fishing, and asking for the permission of the local constable, is that it highlights that Ireland was very much under the rule of landlords. Sometimes in some of the famine references, we've had moments where people said, well, why didn't they fish? They didn't fish because they didn't have access. Access would have only been given to people who were of certain classes, and certainly not the Irish poor. So they couldn't actually access these locations, whether they be coastal or rivers. They were all bordered on private land. And they worked for these people, so they were not going to get themselves into trouble of getting evicted just because they went fishing. Another one of these mentions of gaining access, and I do find that quite funny, and I think it's a bit of a name drop, to be perfectly honest, makes it sound a little bit like he's friends with this particular character. At Cappoquin, the Blackwater changes its due east course directly to the south and is joined from the Waterford side by the Phoenix River opposite Lismore. On a foregoing page, I have written something on the lower Blackwater. The right to several fishery is on this portion of the river and the sea. It has been established by the Duke of Devonshire, together with the fact that such other right had not been given by any deed under due authority in Ireland. The Duke is most generous. Fishing is free to all sojourners at the Devonshire Arms or the Blackwater Vale hotels, which are comfortable and with low tariffs. The best part is known as the Scholar's Throw, made familiar by so many who have read Dr. Pedder's delightful book. Then there is X-Hole, the Island, and the Bull, the Powder Butt, and others of equal measure. In the Blackwater, it's usual to employ a professional aid and often a cot. These fishermen are of exceptional propriety and also so good that I hesitate to individualize one. They have only one fault, their love of preposterous long rods which are needless in a cot. Not only does he give you advice on handling the permissions, he also gives you advice on handling the people. Castle Pollard charges may be taken as reasonable on the average. In the Lake District, bed, board, car hire and boat can be got from there for 3 guineas, or sometimes less per week. The boatmen and carmen should get douceurs, which are best given in lump parting. But luncheon and whisky are expected to be shared with the former, and a bit of baccy, freely given, or on occasion a shilling at the obsequies of a big trout makes friends and sport. If you've ever known anyone from Cavan, this couldn't be more fitting. Douceurs is a tip or a bribe or a little bit of extra cash that may be given. He very rarely mentions the weather, except for when he goes to Mayo. There are several other rivers which afford sport, but the tourist angler needs not their names. To a man who will rough it and explore the country with a portable boat, the fishing resources of Mayo are illimitable. All classes are hospitable, and it is perhaps externally and internally the wettest county in Ireland. I can attest to this because I was recently in County Mayo and it rained every other day and every other hour. So I finally bring you back to the juvenile and immature reason that I bought this book, and this was the device. It is called a coil horn, and I will explain this strap-on coil horn device to you. Many truly good anglers never seem to be able to get rid of the coil without kinks. To meet them, I have to suggest nothing better than the coil horn, which deserves more notice than has been given to it even by the few who've seen it used. Mr. George Loudon of Mayo was, I believe, its inventor, and certainly deserves consideration, if only in recognition of it, of the finest anglers that ever wet a line. He employed it in salmon fishing, but it was equally useful to trout or pike fishers. The illustration explains the contrivance, which should be strapped over the left sleeve of the fishing jacket. Not where I thought it was going to go. From experience, I can vouch that it requires little practice to give off the coils with perfect precision by throwing forward the left hand deftly when using a single-handed rod, or by bending out the wrist a little when both hands are employed in a double-hander. I know, really childish, and I'm quite pleased with myself, to be perfectly honest, because that's the reason I bought it, and I'm going to stick by that. But before I leave you, I will also give you one more little nugget of fascinating information about our Hi Regan, or more so, his amazing daughter. He had 6 children with his wife Isabel, but one of them eclipsed her father's literary fame entirely. Her name was Mary Isabel Dunn. She became the writer with the pen name of George Egerton, one of the most important feminist authors of the late 1800s. She wrote short stories, novels, plays, and even translations that were revolutionary for their time, known for psychological depth and bold statements about women's need for freedom. She became a key figure in what was called the New Women's Movement. So while Dad was out writing about the best sport to catch a trout, his daughter was writing about women catching their independence. This book started as a disappointment. But between the stories, both on the inside and the outside, I enjoyed it much more than I thought it would have been possible. I don't think I can part with this book. It reminds me of an ugly chihuahua. Missing one eye, tongue hanging out the side, only 3 legs, yet you adore it because it's just charming. While Captain Dunn was perpetually getting himself into mischief and seemingly failure, he finally found success at the age of 60. More likely, what he was after was notoriety from his book, How and Where to Fish in Ireland. He ended up with 17 editions of this book, and reprints, as I said, could still be found today. He died at the ripe old age of 75 in London, with Ireland firmly in his heart and mind. And to say goodbye to him, I'm going to read the closing of his own book. Irishmen are not identical with Englishmen. Great ills have occurred to both from an impossible endeavour to force them to be so. Both have, however, some good qualities in common: kind hearts and open hands. I hope this book may encourage many Englishmen to trust and try my countrymen. In Ireland, their first greeting will certainly be Céad Míle Fáilte. Captain John Joseph Dunn, the roguish Hi Regan, leveraged his privilege of class and social station, allowing him to access some of the finest fishing locations in Ireland and to get by through friends, family, and acquaintances. From what I can surmise, he was a charmer. He lived on his wit and personality and was a creative type, and for all this, I found him utterly endearing.
Until next time, may you find the same passion for your pursuits that Captain Dunn brought to his rivers, but perhaps with better financial planning. I'm Avril, and this has been Vices and Volumes. Thank you for listening.